Carlton King, former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show that shines a light on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, but also, indeed, it does major on the world, really, of geopolitics. And that's the world in which we all have a part, or are provided with information that gives us the belief that we have a part to play in our world. And so often what I do is I do what I call a critical thinking episode or episodes, where basically what I ask you, my listeners, to do is to consider maybe something you haven't thought of before. I mean, consider things out of the box rather than the parameters which you're generally told and you have learnt just through an osmosis, really, through listening to the news, reading the media, the mass media, that is, and even being taught it at schools. You just get a feel for certain things. And those things you often don't question. You often basically say that they are correct without ever considering whether they are, without ever assessing yourself whether something is right or wrong. So therefore, what I like to do on these critical thinking issues is to basically go through something in a little bit more depth, go through an issue in a little bit more depth, and let you have an understanding, from my perspective, of course, because you don't need to believe me, from my perspective, as to what I think is the case. Now, last week, this programme, in fact, the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about the daughter of a press czar, really, in Ghislaine Maxwell, and I did that with my podcast wife, Fergus Isaac, and of course we brought in our specialist doctor. So we had another what I think was another fantastic, and I hope you did, a fantastic view of things from that perspective, from a triumphant. So you had Rachel Taylor, who is a doctor, from her perspective. You had Fergus Isaac from the perspective of the media, which is very, very important because that's where most people get their information from. And then you had my perspective from the perspective of secret intelligence, national security, and the policing of how things function in law enforcement, etc. But today, I'm going to do this one by myself because I do that often actually with critical thinking. Because what I want to do is delve without really a lot of discussion from within my side, but to just sort of pass you something and for you then to consider. You don't need to believe it. And I always say to you, please look these things up. Please try and get an understanding. So what is the most burning situation today? Well, I'd suggest, and that the most burning situation is the situation that we talk about when we look at what we often say the Arab-Israeli conflict. In reality, it's not an Arab-Israeli conflict. In reality, it's a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that conflict is one that I won't touch on necessarily directly, but what I want to touch on is a question that has reverberated everywhere. And I was watching a Piers Morgan thing the other day. And for those who don't know, who might listen to this programme, Piers Morgan was the editor of one of Britain's largest newspapers for many, 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 many years. One of its largest red top papers. So in Germany you call it the Boulevardpresse, the general paper that goes out to the general man and woman in the street, rather than being a highbrow newspaper. But for that had a massive circulation. And then, of course, he went to America and had his own show in the United States and was very, very popular. He got close to President Trump and therefore then got even more popular. And he came back to the United Kingdom and had a programme on one of Britain's morning television programmes with great viewership. And he had on his programme recently the other day, he had on Jeremy Corbyn, the former leader of the Labour Party. And he asked the question and said to Jeremy Corbyn, is Hamas a terrorist? Are Hamas, I can't, let me get it exactly right. Are Hamas terrorists? And was this a terrorist action that Hamas carried out on the 7th of October? Terrorists to Hamas. Hamas are terrorists, aren't they, Mr. Corbyn? And Jeremy Corbyn basically didn't answer the question. He didn't say yes. Right, so that made me think, what are we being fed? I know what I think terrorism is, professionally. So for those of you who don't know, I was an officer in Scotland Yard's Special Branch. Now, Scotland Yard Special Branch was the organisation that basically looked at secret intelligence information, national security information, and obtained secret intelligence, got secret intelligence on political organisations. So, obviously from terrorism to espionage to extremism to anything that could undermine the state of the United Kingdom. Now, that's not abnormal. In every country in the world, the primary body for looking at political intelligence is the police. With the exception of Britain, to be fair, because we have it in a dual system. We have a thing called the Security Service, which is better known as MI5, which also collects this type of information in a different way because it has no police powers, can't arrest people, can't question people, etc., whereas the police can do that. So the Special Branch, in one hand from Scotland Yard, and the Security Service, better known as MI5 in Britain, perform this role. Now, very, very quickly, before the Special Branch was the first body, it was formed in 1883. And the reason why I mention this, it was formed in 1883 to defeat a then terrorist organisation. And that organisation was the Fenian Brotherhood. So the forerunner, if you will, of the IRA. Now, what were these people doing? They were blowing people up. They were blowing up the political infrastructure, attempting to blow up the political infrastructure, and carrying out political assassinations of British politicians because they wanted Ireland, the whole of Ireland, free from, as they would put it, the yoke of Britain. In other words, they wanted to run their own country, something which they hadn't done for about 500 years, I think, at that time. But they wanted to run their own country. Of Ireland. So back in 1883, they decided to carry out a campaign of what, obviously the press, etc., called terror. Now, I mention the press again, and why do I mention the press? Because, as I say in every week actually, in my introduction to this programme, it's geopolitics at its most basic. Now, geopolitics often means between several different countries, but it also should mean between the people and the state and how that functions. So, and what that passes on to others. So in reality, what the newspapers of the day were writing, the Times, etc., were that these were terrorists, bandits, traitors to the country who were trying to destroy the British system by undermining our law and lawful presence in Ireland. Because you got to see Ireland as part of the United Kingdom as it was perceived. The United Kingdom, which now we call Northern Ireland, but then it would have been Ireland and Great Britain. So it was a part of the country trying to pull away, and hence they were terrorists. Read for that today. A few years back, they've now got an agreement, but the Basques in Spain, or as it will be perceived now in Spain, example, the Catalan, some of whom wished to secede from the state of Spain, and if they carry out any acts that the state doesn't like, they will be terrorists. Right now they're extremists, but if they carry out violent acts, it will be perceived as terrorism. Now the question is about the violence. So first of all, what we need to do, I believe, is we need to define terrorism, and indeed, so yes, I only told you one part of my background. What I should have also said is I was also an officer in Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service, which is better known as MI6. And my job in that organisation was specifically to fight terrorism around the world. So not necessarily in the United Kingdom, but around the world. So organisations that we perceived as terrorists, that we perceived that would undermine us, and in the days we were talking about, that was anything from many so-called Palestinian organisations that have carried out some actions, to also organisations like N17, which is a Greek organisation that assassinated a British defence attaché, to organisations like the IRA acting abroad, to which we generally more left to the special branch and to the security service MI5 actually to carry out those acts. But obviously we're getting against the IRA, but we're getting information from abroad as well. And then we were looking at all the other organisations from many different parts of the world, the Shining Path, combative cells. I could go on and on and on with a number of groups that we had perceived as terrorists, Hezbollah, and obviously in the time when I was looking at it, the Islamicist groups like Al-Qaeda and so forth and so on. As well as some of the right-wing groups, because at the time, of course, you were talking about actions carried out in Serbia. So some of the Serb right-wing groups, and some groups like the PKK and others. So you were obviously left-wing, but so moving forward, as we perceived terrorism. So what is terrorism? Well, the definition that I had dealt with in the past was the unlawful use of violence and intimidation. So you see, it doesn't even need to be violent, because this is how the state ties things up. The unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. Hence why the special branch was involved in the pursuit of political aims. This is the whole point. Your actions were to carry out some political prospect. Yeah. So that basically was, or is, the definition of terrorism. So straight away, what you can see is that one man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. Now, you're going to often hear that, but although people hear it often, they sometimes really don't understand what it means. So let me give you an example. A very simple example. So I'm a black guy, as people may or may not know. Now, I'm living in South Africa, let's say, and it's pre-1989. And in order for me to do anything, I've been allotted what's known as a country within South Africa, a Bantustan. So what they're going to say to me is your heritage is whatever they think it is. Now, this is the white regime that's doing this. And therefore, we've set aside for you various little countries, like Lesotho and whatever, little countries in South Africa, which they keep backward and they don't allow you to do anything, but that's where you actually belong. So when you're in South Africa proper, you actually don't belong here. So you really have no rights in this country of South Africa, a country which for thousands of years my ancestors have been in, say, as a black South African. But I don't have any rights there. Now, they're going to turn around and say, Zulus weren't there, and maybe even the Shona came later on, etc., etc. So they're going to come up with reasons why, for whatever reason it is, South Africa belongs to the whites, but it doesn't belong, and the people who came to South Africa from the Netherlands, rather than the Brits who came subsequently and ran the country. But they're going to say reasons why it doesn't belong to you, it belongs to us. And this is often the case with settler states. Often states that come in, Europeans come into another state, they say it was terra incognito. In other words, there was nobody living there when we came and took over. We took over, it was empty. So, the reason why I mention all of this is then, what choice do the people have who lived there, but who now have their rights severely undermined? Because remember, I've said to you, they've got these Bantustans, so which are small little enclaves of inside South Africa, which they have no freedom of movement, no real control over the systems. But the South Africans control, the white South Africans control everything of these states, but they say this is where all the blacks belong to. That means, of course, democratically, the blacks can't vote in South Africa, so they can't vote the system out. Which means, of course, that the system will always be perpetrated for the white people, for 1/5 of the population, and that 1/5 of the population will be the only ones who can run the system. Okay? Sometimes even less than 1/5, depending upon the time when you look at South Africa as a state and the numbers of various peoples within it. So you come into South Africa, you get a pass, and you're allowed to work in South Africa, which is not your country, by the way, they're now saying, because you've had that country taken off you, and you're allowed to work in that place, and you're allowed to work under the auspices of the whites, and maybe you do get a permit, or maybe you don't get a permit. Whenever a police officer stops you, you've got to show your pass to show where you come from, that you're allowed to working here for X amount of time. And you can overstay, and you can be put in prison very, very easily, etc., etc., etc. So you can see where this is going. So you can't get your rights via voting because you don't belong to the country, albeit that your ancestors did. You can't get your rights and demand what you want to do because you've got no freedom of movement, because at the end of the day you don't belong there because you're not a South African. You're not allowed to open or do anything other than what the state tells you can do, and you can only live where the state says you can live, which is why you had big areas like Soweto or wherever where blacks were allowed to live. But of course that could be taken from them at any stage if whites needed to expand or whatever needed to happen. So this system, known as apartheid in the language of Afrikaans, which is basically Dutch, some German, English thrown in, that type of language, which is living apart but kind of the same. Because they always do this. It's the same. You could go to some states of the United States and find exactly the same. What we'll do for you, we'll give you equal rights, but you have all the rubbish, but you've got equal rights. But you can't sit at our lunch counters, you can't sit at our place, you can't sit on the front of the bus, you must sit at the back of the bus. The same systems worked in a whole load of places. So, United States, South Africa, you can go to the British Caribbean, and other colonies, British African colonies, and you'll get exactly the same to some extent, yeah, where there's a privileged position for the whites at the top, because those are the ones who rule the system, originally by force of arms. All the work, by the way, this is one of the things they tell you, we built this. You'll always hear that, we built this, otherwise there'd be nothing there. Well, actually, the people doing the building were generally the indigenous blacks, or if it was another type of people, the indigenous brown people, or whatever they were who were taken over. They were the people actually who did all the building. Those are the people who did all the work. Those are the people who tilled the fields. Those are the people who worked the industry. Those are the people who made everything happen within the state, but had none of the pleasures, the rights, the freedoms, and definitely not the advantage of living in a system that is superb for the 1/5 for which everybody else is working to give them the best standard of living going. So the question then is, what do people do to fight against this process. So what they do is they say, I'm not having this anymore. I want my rights. So they then, first of all, take political action. Generally, starts with generally peaceful action. They put demonstrations. Well, the demonstrations are made illegal. Okay, so the state, the politicians, and this is another thing people need to understand, the politicians set the goals, set the laws, set what people can do. The police, and I don't care what system you're in, only carry out those systems. The police do not set the systems up. The police do not set the laws up. The police do not set up whether you can demonstrate or not in terms of a law. You see, the laws have been changed in the United Kingdom now to make them stricter as to where you and when you can demonstrate. That's not the police doing that. What you'll find, the government will turn around and say, the police want new powers. Well, the police never ask for new powers, to be fair, 9 times out of 10. The government foists powers on the police, and then the police have to carry out powers in line with what the government have foisted on them. Because if they don't, and the problem is that the police in most countries at the very, very top are yes men and women, if they don't, they then say, you haven't done what's within your power. So if you can look at and you might think I'm jumping around, but I'm not. Stay with me. If you look at you may have seen the large Palestinian demonstration that happened on the same day as the Armistice Day, calling, funnily enough, for an armistice, a stop to warfare in Palestine-occupied territories of Gaza. So they're calling for an armistice on Armistice Day, but somehow that is said to be negative because on Armistice Day, somebody's calling for an armistice. Work it through. Doesn't matter what the conflict is. What they're saying is there's an armistice we want to happen, i.e. a stopping of fighting, a cease of fighting, on a day set aside to commemorate the stopping of fighting. The stopping of fighting, right? So they say, that's disrespectful for the people who died fighting to stop war. Now, the reality of the situation is, and I'll say this very, very quickly because this comes a slight little bit off the subject, but we often talk about women not having suffrage. And therefore, we talk about the suffragettes. And bear with me because it all comes back, it's all political. When you think politically, and this is critical thinking, you must see the whole picture. So please don't see this. Please don't see me as being in some way attempting to befuddle your mind or even being arrogant in some way. But what I'm trying to say is think the whole thing through, because this is what I mean by critical thinking. Even if you think what I'm talking is rubbish, just think it through, and once you've thought it through, then say it's rubbish. That's what I'm trying to say. So when I come into this, we've moved a little bit, and I'm talking about suffrage now. So we often say women didn't have any suffrage until the end of the First World War in Britain. That women, Mrs. Pankhurst, fought for that freedom, and that men enjoyed the right to vote. Actually, work the figures through, and I would say to you that of the roundabout First World War losses in Britain for men is about 800,000 British dead. And that obviously includes some of the smaller colonies like the Caribbean are included in those numbers. The Indian forces who died, 300,000 or whatever it was, are not included in that figure. Aussies are not included in that figure, and much less people died from Australia than did from India. New Zealand, Canada, etc. are not included in that figure because they come up, and South Africa, they come up under their own figures because they were dominions. They were a more... if you will, they had a greater amount of freedom for the British people who ran the systems there. So it wasn't Indians running India, it was the Brits running India, but they had a greater degree of freedom as to how they ran India, rather than, say, the more stronger colonial hold on, say, West Africa, East Africa, run by the Britons, Hong Kong, the Caribbean, etc., etc. So many of the dead of these sort of countries come under that British dead. So of those people dying, I would estimate that 70% of them did not have the vote. I'll say that again. 70% of those Britons who died, men who died, and it was all men who died, did not have the vote. So again, this is how you see how the media and how the system can twist things to give you a belief, that is not true. Okay, number one, you have to be property owning classes, or if not, you have to have a certain wealth level, and you have to be 21. Now, the vast majority of people fighting in the First World War were like 18. Many were 17. In fact, we all know of people who were 15, 16 who were fighting. Yes, they lied about their age, but recruiters weren't really bothered about that so much. So you know, if you think you're fighting a war, that everybody's going into the war having a vote and fighting a war for freedom, etc., 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 again, you can question whether that's anything true about that at all. So that's what I'm saying. So when we come back to our South Africa perspective, as I was saying, what do I do as this black guy in South Africa? What do I do to look after myself and defend myself and potentially get myself some rights? Well, what might happen is you might say, I'll take up arms because I've tried my demonstration. They've been made illegal. Water cannon or whatever has been thrown against me. I've been imprisoned. I've been beaten by police who are carrying out the actions from what the state says. Now, how they carry them out, obviously, is down to police. And if you get officers who want to beat you with a stick because he feels he's superior to you, because that's what he's been told all the way through school, that I'm a white guy and this is my country, South Africa. These blacks are interlocutors. And they're trying to spoil a good system, and I'm living very well under it, so I'm going to give you a good hiding because you should know your place, shouldn't you, N? Right? Or in South African terms, Kaffa, you should know your place, so I'm going to beat the hell out of you, right? So I've tried that, and I got beaten up. So the next mode is, let's try something a little bit different. Let's try this intimidation often. So it's, I'll try and say, if you don't do this, I'll do this. That alone makes you a terrorist. So now the state says you are a terrorist. So now the state has a whole load of laws which it can use to tackle you, to stop you carrying out your actions. And that means in prison. So I'm Nelson Mandela, and I say, okay, we are in the ANC, and often what you'll find in organisations, and I should make this clear, same with the IRA later on, you're going to have two parts of an organisation, same, by the way, with Hamas. You're going to have a part of an organisation which is political, and to be fair, oftentimes, whose leaders do not take up arms. Oftentimes they do, but oftentimes they don't. They have an affinity with armed struggle comrades, the ones who actually take up arms. So if you look at the South African situation, you've got the ANC, the African National Congress, which is the political body who carries out the political actions and who works politically to try and get freedom. And then you've got the military wing thereof, the Enconte Sizwe, as it is in South Africa. Or if you look at the IRA, you've got the if you're the political wing, which is Sinn Féin, and then you've got the armed wing, which is the IRA, or if you look at Hamas, again, they generally both come under the same wing, although there are other groups within Hamas which are affiliated, like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad example. Not the same organisation, but has an affiliation because it sees the same path that it wants to work down. But you've got Hamas doing a lot of political things, politically, and then you've got Hamas fighters doing the fighting actions, and there's several, the Angels of, the Angels, the Martyrs units, there's loads of various names for these who are doing the fighting. Now, the degree to which the political and the military are in unison is always questionable. And I would say 9 times out of 10 they are in unison. But of course, the question then comes, can you arrest people for being political who are not carrying out actions? That's the question. You got to figure that through, and this is what the way the law is. Now, some of you may be asking, I'm saying this, but I was in an organisation that's trying to fight against terrorism. Yeah, very true. Because on some occasions, now I put myself in the South Africa situation. What would I do? I'm a black guy. I've got really no choice but to run on the black side. Because what I'm not going to do is run on the other side, which because of my colour I can't run on anyway, even if I wish to. Yes, I could join the police, and there were blacks in the police in South Africa, which basically held the system as it was. To me, that's a cop-out. That's you keeping your people down. But if the system looked as though it was in the round fair, then maybe I do go on the side of the government of the day if we can get our means and our rights and and all our laws by going through a pure political perspective. When you can't, that's pointless. And I'm going to say that as a person who is in law and order, who is in secret intelligence, who is in national security. When you think about it, in Britain, I would argue that if you're agitating for, let's say, communism, it is possible for you to work that through the ballot. You won't get voted in because there's not going to be enough of you presently. I'm not going to say that won't happen in the future. So what happens is people who then utilise other people to carry out those actions, organisations that say we want communism, but we won't put ourselves on the line, but we'll actually use the other people to do that, the people who are at most threat. So oftentimes that's people who are of colour, or people who are poor, or people who have little stake in the system. We'll use them to bring about the system that we want. Yeah, extremism, could even be terrorism, depending on how far you go. We'll use them in order to get what we want to make our system. But we're not really interested in those people. Those people are just, if you will, the tool, the vanguard, the tool of the people they utilise to get what they want to bring about. And the people who get hurt in that interim are always the people who are being used, not the people who are trying to change the system for their aims and for their good, and not necessarily for the good of all, but for their belief of what is good. So that's why I can justify my position. Because I think in the United Kingdom, you can get what you require going through the system, and you don't need to blow people up, etc., etc. Now, that becomes a little bit more difficult when you start talking about esoteric things, like, example, a religious perspective. That could be Christian, but right now it stands to be Islamic generally. But it could be anything, Buddhist, if you want to go to somewhere like Myanmar. So if you have a belief that your religious system is superior, and this is what you find in the United States, that your religious system is superior, and to uphold that and to keep that religious system superior, what you do is you purposefully go out to kill people because you think this is one way of drawing everybody together in order to fight the conflict which we believe to bring about our system, right? Then, again, what do? Does a state have a right to defend itself? I guess it does against that system. So it's all a matter of questioning why the state is defending itself and what it's doing. Now, the reason why I'm saying this again, and I probably haven't been sharp enough in putting forward my position. I've used the one country of South Africa just to explain it. So if it means that, example, in a particular country, let's take Northern Ireland, that because of the way the system's been set up, that one set of people are continually being disadvantaged the whole time, and they cannot change anything because the people who run the system have within it the advantage of staying strong within that system, and all the advantages are there, and they don't want to give it up. Who wants to give up advantage? Practically nobody. Then, how do the other people who are being undermined prevent that process? If the people at the top on the and the reason why I'm saying system, because it could be religious, it could be so Catholic against Protestant, it could be based on colour, it could be based on nationality, it could be based on a whole host of issues, it could even be based as simple on class, right? So if the system doesn't allow a co-opting between it, people to move between and to take some of the advantage, but only always looks after what it perceives to be its own, and actually denigrates the others to give them no opportunity, then you are pushing people towards terror. There is zero doubt about that. Right? The sheer act alone of taking somebody's land will push you towards terror. Why? Because the people who have taken your land will deed your actions, when you put your actions against them, as terrorist. Regardless of what you do, they will call it terrorism. I'll cite you another example. After the Twin Towers went down, again, I told you I was working for the Secret Intelligence Service, and I was working in the area of countering terrorism worldwide. After the Twin Towers went down, the United States made it very, very clear. We used to work very, very closely with the United States, with the CIA and the FBI, but particularly the CIA. Made it very, very clear that their military was going to attack Afghanistan, because that's where the action came out of in terms of Al-Qaeda being sat in Afghanistan. So I wrote a paper and informed saying this is the worst thing that can be done to attack Afghanistan, because all that will happen, and made it known to the most senior people in that organisation, all that will happen is you will recruit more people to the cause of Islamic terrorism. Let's call it Islamic terrorism. You recruit more people to that cause. Because what will happen is you will not see it in the West, but they will see it in the East when we go in as a military body, as an aggressive military posture. We will kill a whole load of civilians. We will kill a whole host of individuals who are the brothers, the sisters, the aunts, the uncles, the fathers, the mothers, the children, the cousins. And the other factor is, by the way, in a lot of the countries that we talk about, extended family means much more than it does in the West. So my cousin fifth removed means something to me if I'm sitting in the Middle East. It doesn't mean that much to me if I'm sitting in the West, right? It means something to me if I'm sitting in Africa. It's blood. They are blood. And so if you don't understand that, you've got a problem right there. So you are collectively punishing people for something which, by the way, they had nothing to do with. Yes, an organisation sitting in their country did it and has authorised individuals to do it. But I surmised that if you paid enough gold to the people who, Mullah Omar and the people who were running Afghanistan at the time, that, bin Laden would be given up. If not, carry on doing what we were doing before, which is a police action. And I don't mean the police are doing it, but what I mean is, and if you read my book, Black Ops, The Incredible True Story of a British Secret Agent, I kind of explain this in there. So if you want a little bit more depth on it, you can read my book. But the point that I'm making is, what I was suggesting is do not do this attack. Don't do it. I know the American seems to want to prove that he cannot be hit, and therefore he will, take the state of the United States. They will show that they are superior and they can go into Afghanistan and take over and run the system. Right. It's counterproductive. And indeed, I'll go a step further. It's what bin Laden wanted to happen. See, what one needs to understand with organisations of terrorism, and we're calling it terrorism, and I'm going to come back with another explanation in a while. What you need to understand is that if you're fighting for a cause, you need people to come with you in the fight for the cause. So how do you achieve that? This is the biggest problem any organisation has, be it a terrorist, political organisation, whatever it might be, is to bring people with them, to be popularist, if you will. We're using that presently in the United Kingdom by talking about people coming over the sea in boats. A few people. Literally, it's a few people in reality to the amount of migration coming into the United Kingdom. But to hide the actual normal migration, we talk about the few people who come across in boats. Even if it's 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, it's chicken feed to the actual numbers of hundreds of thousands. Right? Who are coming legally in that sense from countries that we're happy to bring through. Right, okay. And by the way, these coming across on boats are not illegal. They're only illegal once we say they're not refugees because they've gone through the system. Because that's what the law is. I mean, you might not like the law, but that's the law we created, right? So that's what it is. So that's how governments bring people together. They say, oh, look at these boats, look at that, bam, bam. People look at it, people get angry about this, people, what's happening, this injustice that's happening to us. Terrorist organisations, if you want to call them that, are organisations that don't believe in the same that we do, organisations that want to change things. As I said to you before, it might be you want to bring communism about, it might be you want to bring right-wing populism, it might be you want to bring fascism into play. Whatever it is, you need to bring the people with you, the vast majority of the people, because only 10% of the people actually do anything, ever. And I call them the talented 10. It doesn't mean to say that they're good. They could be devilishly bad. But those are the 10% of the people that do something. The 90% of the people actually don't do much at all. They just follow the crew. So you're looking at trying to bring this 10% or a biggest number of this 10% with you. So what you want to do now is to bring them into action. So what bin Laden knew was, if I hit the United States, which has never been hit before on any real scale, the United States, it will be a pinprick. I can't really hit the United States with any real effort or situation. I can't. It will be a pinprick. Now, 3,001 people, you'll say, is not a pinprick. It's 3,000 people. But if I started to list to you the numbers of attacks that the United States has done to change governments and countries since the Second World War, indeed, I don't think the United States soldiers, military, around the world have ever not been at war, even if it's undeclared, been fighting some type of conflict since the end of the Second World War for more than a week. I'll say that again. I don't think the United States has had its military not in some form of conflict, some sort of declared or undeclared conflict, for more than 1 week since the Second World War. And it is the only country that has been doing that. It has something like 800 bases around the world, the United States. Just to give you an example, right? 800 bases around the world, right? China, example, which now the United States is saying is a dastard country, everybody needs to hit on China, China's terrible, has one base outside of China. I'll repeat that, one base in Djibouti, outside of China. The United States has 800 different facilities outside of the United States. Okay? So this is where your mind needs to figure out, well, what's going on? Who's doing what? And unfortunately, the CIA is an organisation that talks a lot about its actions. So it will say, example, that we overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran back in 1953, the Mossadegh government. The problem was it was left-wing, so it was orientating itself towards the Soviet Union. They thought, it wasn't necessarily, but that's what the feeling was. It was orientating itself. The reality is that the United States... And I laugh slightly because the reality is that the United States is really a fiscal state. What I mean by that is that business basically runs the way the United States functions. So the fear wasn't that Mossadegh was really a left-wing individual that might go. It was that actually the oil companies were going to lose out, right? So the oil companies, which have been pumping the oil out of Iran forever and a day, were going to lose out. So what do? You overthrow the government, you put in the Shah of Iran, make the Shah a person who's dependent upon you, and then you know the oil's going to keep flowing and you're going to get the best oil deals, still forever and a day. Okay, now that's not just the United States do that. We've done it, French do it, a whole lot of countries do it who have the capability and capacity. So that's what you've got to look at. Now, why do I mention that? Because it seems to look a little bit off the subject. No, it doesn't. The reason why I mention that is to bring you again into into an understanding of the bigger picture. So if you look at the Second World War, and you look at the fall of France, so France has fallen to the Germans. The Germans sign a peace treaty, or should I say the French sign a peace treaty with the Germans in, just by the way, it doesn't really matter whether they do it this way, but in the same carts, a railway cart that the Germans had to sign the peace treaty with the French after the First World War, and exacted on the Germans a heavy toll. Hitler made sure that the Germans signed, that the French signed the peace treaty, the end the cessation of violence treaty, with the Germans in that same cart, just to hammer home the fact that we've now taken over. And the agreement then is that the southern half of France, which will be called Vichy France, that half from Vichy down, Vichy will be the capital thereof, that half will be run by the French under German tutelage, and the northern parts of France will be effectively, how can I put it, a German state. Not even occupied Germany, because they're not even going to call it occupied, because the war's over as far as they're concerned. The French have signed, General Pétain has signed, and the war is over. Now, the German argument was, we still need to be in the north because, of course, we want to be in the Pas-de-Calais, we want to go over into Britain in the end, and we want to fight Britain. So we will need the northern area to be secured by German forces. Right. Now, I think I'm right in saying that supposedly sometime down the line, when the Brits are defeated, or the Brits have sued for peace, because what you need to understand is, of course, Hitler was not against the British suing for peace. Indeed, let's get this right again so people understand, Germany did not declare war on Britain. So Germany did not start the war. I'm going to say that again. Germany did not start the Second World War. Britain and France declared war on Germany, not the other way around. The Germans said they wanted Lebensraum in the east, living room, extension of the living, and that was going to go towards the east, right? So what they're doing is pushing into East Germany and into the eastern regions, and then finally their aim was obviously to take on the Soviet Union and take over the Soviet Union, which, of course, Winston Churchill would be happy with that, but the problem was he didn't want anybody to win, because anybody who won would be too powerful. So Churchill was all gung-ho for fighting Germans earlier on. Eden was a little bit different. He was happy to cede some elements, so the Sudetenland example in what was then Czechoslovakia, the loss of Czechoslovakia, but he put a stop at it on Poland, not because he really had a treaty with Poland, or we and the French had a treaty with Poland, but more importantly, because you could see that the German power would be unstoppable. So you need to stop them now before they become too powerful. And then they figured they may turn their view on Britain subsequently, and France fought on France subsequently. So, and France thought that would happen quicker than it would to Britain. So therefore, the reason why I'm just mentioning that is just to clear that bit up. So what you've got is, you've got now German forces looking for peace, actually, with Britain, in order to stop that war so they could concentrate what they always wanted to concentrate on, what Hitler's main game was in the beginning, because he wanted to deal with the untermenschen, the subhumans that were in the East, and that's what he called them, subhumans. So the Holocaust was going to be not only against Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and socialists, but against Slavic peoples in the East. That's what he wanted to do in the end. And of course, millions upon millions upon millions of Soviets lost their lives in that area. For Soviets, we call them Russians. It's not just Russians, it's Ukrainians, all the countries that were part of the Soviet Union, so the 15 different countries that there are now, which used to be 15 different parts of the Soviet Union, obviously Russia being the biggest, but then you had all of Soviet Central Asia, your Uzbekistans and your Azerbaijan and Georgia, etc., and then you had the Western Belarus and the Ukraines, and then you have the Easterns. So what you had, all this was at one stage, I say this for my younger listeners, at one stage the Soviet Union, and therefore what Hitler wanted to happen with that was for that to be taken. Now subsequently, as we know, the Soviet Union breaks up, and that's a different subject. But still on France, because I'm using France now as the example, I used South Africa as an example before, France as the example, the French have signed this peace treaty, okay? So now, a French general, very famous, who will subsequently become the leader of France once the Second World War is over, General de Gaulle, goes to Britain and says, I'm now creating, under the British auspices, a free French army, and that army will fight for France's freedom from the Germans. Now you've got a problem, see, because it's all about politics. So now you've got the French actual government that says, war is over, we're at peace with the Germans, we've got this area Vichy, which we're kind of running, they've got the northern area, but at some stage we can bring it back into France, so we are now finished, no more war, over, done. And then you've got this guy, this pesky general, who's across in Britain, talking about, let's form a free French army, let's get fighting the Germans on the soil. And by the way, not just the Germans. See, this is the other thing people don't kind of understand. Let's fight the French collaborators, which is what they call the government who's made a decision to be at peace with Germany. Let's fight them as well. Okay? So that's what he's saying, not just the Germans. Let's fight the collaborators. So what, and these organisations, we'll know them as the Maquis or the Free French or the French Resistance, etc., etc. These various different names for them. But these guys were then fighting in France during the Second World War. So my question is, what are they? I'll answer you the question. Terrorists. Dead simple. They're terrorists. They're blowing up trains, they're killing German soldiers, they're killing French police, they're killing people who they see collaborate, mayors of towns or whatever. They're killing a whole host of people that have decided that the war is over, but the French government has decided the war's over. Right? So what they are now are terrorists, according to, obviously, the Germans and according to the Vichy French. And the French police seek them out and hand them over to the Germans or deal with them themselves. If it's in Vichy area, they deal with themselves. If not, in the north, they hand them over to the Germans to be dealt with, and that means execution when they're captured. Sometimes torture and execution to find out what information they know to be able to get back into the other parts of the organisation that are still fighting for France, although they should not be fighting because the war is over. So they're terrorists, according to, obviously, the Free French, to the Vichy French, and to the Germans. They're terrorists. So you see, this is the perspective of one man's terrorist and another man's freedom fighter. Right. This is the point. And this is what you need to understand, the complexity of that process about who is a terrorist and who isn't a terrorist. And when do we name that? When do we see that as such? So that was the end of part 1 of this week's 2-part episode, which you will hear next week. Hope you stay with me and hope you've enjoyed this week's, and we'll get back to the discussion next week. See you then.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, And don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
More than a quarter of a century, I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.